Hi, Lou here for part 2 of enabling role-playing game design to fit the theme. Some people don't want their games to relate closely to reality, or at least not significantly anyway. They're trying to get away from reality, to escape to somewhere else. And that's always been a major function of games. But for RPGs, that's the antithesis of what players want. RPGs are supposed to connect to some reality, although usually a fictional reality. Now, storytelling games is a different situation. Levels of complexity are important too. Not so long ago, I encountered some people playing a role-playing game, Dystopia Rising, and I spent a few hours reading the settings literature, which was really interesting. It turned out the setting was post-zombie apocalypse, but you didn't get that to begin with. It just gradually came into it. And it was really atmospheric and really interesting. And it cried out for simple rules. Unfortunately, the game rules were disastrously awkward, just horrible. For almost any action you were going to do, you'd roll lots of 10-sided dice. Not just a couple, lots, 4, 5, 6, 7 sometimes. Combat required several rolls per attack of bunches of 10-sided dice. It was as though the designer had not designed any games that set out to be different or innovate, and the result was just awful. It was far too complex for what it needed. Now, another question. Different people have different criteria for what corresponds and what doesn't. Standards have relaxed greatly in the past, say, 40, 50 years, owing to TV and film. We accept things in TV and film that when I was a kid, which is 50 years ago, people would have said, this is ridiculous. So to someone with a demanding standard, me, someone who read lots of history when I was growing up, some of the explanations for how this corresponds to something only sound like excuses. One of my favorites is in Kingmaker. Kingmaker is a very popular game about the English Civil War, English War of the Roses. And because of the way the rules are constructed, the natural thing to do is to turtle. In other words, sit there and don't do anything and wait for something to happen. So the designer added cards that get drawn every turn, and some of those cards call a noble to another place. So if the player has that noble, the noble goes to that other place where he gets jumped by whoever happens to be nearby. Now, that's a complete fail as a functional model. Nobody would be that stupid to go down where all the enemies are, even if they were called by their duties. They just wouldn't go. So the game fails dismally as a functional model, though perhaps it succeeds somewhat as an emotional model of chaos. Now, another thing that can happen is people may confuse theme with telling a story. So some people may feel a game can only have a theme if it tells an explicit story, that is to say, a story being told by the designer or by a referee who is godlike, as many referees are, as opposed to one who's just interpreting the rules. I think a game can model a setting or situation without imposing a story on the players, and then the players write their own story. That's my philosophy. So I can set up an adventure and have several different groups go through it, and they all do things completely differently. It's quite amazing because I'm not trying to force them to do any particular thing. Let players write their own story. Now I'm going to close this with a question about combat. Many RPGs feature combat. Not all of them, but many of them. Certainly the most well-known like Dungeons & Dragons do. Now, the question is, if you don't use a board and pieces to represent maneuver and spatial relationships in combat, have you succeeded or have you failed? I'd say you have to have those things. If you don't use them, you have failed. Now, you can use a simplified board. I've developed a system where you can have 3 characters in a square rather than just one, and It provides some maneuver and so on without being as explicit and detailed as some of the games that are called like Fantasy Squad Leader. But if you don't have maneuver, you cannot really represent combat. Warfare or armed conflict is always about maneuver as much as about slaughter. And the best generals succeed by using maneuver rather than by killing. If there's no maneuver in the game, what happens to the correspondence with the reality? To me, it's lost. Now, of course, we can say models can be too real. If you're modeling what amounts to war, because war is ugly, war is not fun, war is the opposite of sport and the opposite of games. Also, too much detail doesn't necessarily help a game fit the theme, but it certainly makes the game harder to play. We can look at this in terms of constraints. Modern game players don't particularly like constraints, but a game is, by its very nature, a set of constraints. When you play a game, you're agreeing to be constrained in various ways. If there's a board, the board constrains what you can do. There are rules. You can't do things that aren't within the rules. You're constrained at every point. A strong model, well, let's start with the story. An explicit story has many constraints. You have to follow the story. You don't have freedom of action. A strong model has constraints, but fewer than an explicit story. History in general has some constraints, and games about specific battles are often highly constrained. In a sense, your campaign and your setting are history. Now, on the other hand, abstract games only have the constraints that are engendered by playing the game, the gameplay constraints, the rule constraints. So, it's not really possible to sum up, but certainly you can consider functional ways of modeling, emotional ways of modeling, or even cosmetic ones where things look like something but it doesn't act that way at all. And that's one of the big questions you have to decide. Thanks for listening.